What impact has No Child Left Behind had on what is taught or how teaching occurs in Minnesota's classrooms?
The only good impact I would attribute to it is that it's heightened awareness at the teacher level about the value of using data. In effect, a federal gun was put to our head and we had to do certain things by a certain time. It forced those who might otherwise have resisted to come along in that transition, and it's an important transition to make. Beyond that, it's done no good that I know of. It's taking time away from teaching. It's taking focus away from some of the things that should be taught.
So is it possible to reform No Child Left Behind?
I think not. I mean, part of my objection to No Child Left Behind is rooted in the specifics of the law itself. Part of my belief system, based on a life of experience, not just in education, but in politics and government and in business, is the idea of who's writing the law. The whole premise is based on the theory that the federal government can effectively make education policy that can be applied on a one-size-fits-all basis to every classroom in America. And I think that's a false premise to begin with. I just don't think it's rational to believe that Congress and the federal bureaucracy has any way to make rational educational policy for everybody. I just don't think that's doable.
If a national one-size-fits-all education policy is ineffective and irrational, how can a statewide policy in a diverse state like Minnesota work?
First of all, it's important to point out that it did for a very long time. For decades, more than a century, policy-making decisions about education, many policy-making decisions were made from the beginning of the days of the territory. The state's constitution charges the state with that responsibility. In those days, the local financial decisions were in many cases made by the local school board, but a lot of the policy decisions were made in St. Paul, and successfully. Starting with the late 60s or early 70s and all of the various court cases that led up to the creation of the Minnesota Miracle, the state was also put in a position by the courts of taking over responsibility for equity and funding. And then as soon as the state's checkbook came into play, then the state became the policymaker. And I must say did very well for 3 decades of being able to develop educational policies that could work on the Iron Range and work in the city and work in the suburbs and work in my hometown in southern Minnesota, just because the policymakers involved are much closer to the people affected by the decisions, and it was a shared responsibility between legislators and school board members who knew each other and who had a much better and informed sense of their communities and of the cultural and other values of those communities, and they could craft something that worked.
Would Minnesota be better off without federal funding for No Child Left Behind, and is that really a possibility?
I think the answer to the first question is yes. I think we would be better off as a high standard state. I think any state who's on the high end of the spectrum in terms of their expectations of education standards for their kids, I think any such state would be better off going their own way, as opposed to allowing their policy to be perverted by the need for, or the perceived need for, these federal dollars. Yes, I think we'd be better off. Is it likely to happen? I think not. Certainly not under this governor. He's very close to the very policymakers who made the law, and he has repeatedly and consistently indicated his support for it. I can't imagine the legislature finding a way to get around him, even if they wanted to.
You wrote in your article that you don't believe that No Child Left Behind was an honest attempt at accountability in our public schools. And I was wondering if I could get you to speak to that a little.
It's impossible for me to believe. I can't speak to the motives of every individual who voted on it, one way or the other. Everybody who ever walked by a schoolhouse thinks they know how to run one. And so there may be many people who voted on it who aren't, really day-to-day professionals on these issues, and who looked at it and said, yeah, that makes sense. So I can't speak to all of them, but the drivers behind No Child Left Behind, I believe, had a deliberate motive in mind, and that is to discredit public education and to ultimately privatize it. The fact is that there are folks behind this and folks in government today who believe that the time of public education is past, that it should be replaced. And the conundrum is that 86% of the public doesn't agree with them. And so if you've got an agenda and the public is overwhelmingly in opposition to that agenda, you have to find some way to shift enough people, to change enough minds, to get them to agree with you to get what you want. And in this case, that's to find a way to discredit public schools. This is not the only item, only effort that they've undertaken in terms of their kind of disinformation and other political efforts, but it is certainly the most profoundly impactful on kids. If they go around and give campaign speeches and trash talk public schools, that doesn't hurt kids. No Child Left Behind hurts kids.